How the two boys came to be stranded at the bottom of the empty well was a mystery to them both. They could remember nothing of that day up until the moment they were aware of their new surroundings. Having lost consciousness after accidentally falling into the well seemed the most likely explanation, but neither boy had any cuts or bruises corresponding to such a mighty fall. The far-off sliver of light above them looked to be all of 30 or 40 feet away, and such a fall would have undoubtedly killed them both. The shaft of the well was made of bricks. In the darkness there looked to be a series of footholds, where a ladder of some kind had once been sighted, but it was impossible to tell how far those footholds travelled. The ground was uneven and boggy, and strewn with all kinds of debris, planks of wood, old fishing nets, and rusted fence posts, things people had thrown down the shaft when the well had fallen into disuse. Down the walls trickled a stream of water, which pooled in one corner. Thirsty, both boys drank a little and splashed it over their faces and necks. It was then they noticed the rucksack leaning against the far wall. Eagerly they unzipped it, finding a large hunting knife, a box of matches, an empty water canister, a bottle of pure spirit, bandages, and a wristwatch. The time, according to the watch, was 7:46 in the PM, but they had no way of verifying this. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the boys called for help, hoping someone would hear and come to their rescue. For what felt like a very long time, they shouted until hoarse, and it became clear no one was passing the well at that particular moment. After much discussion, the boys decided to try and climb out of the shaft. If one stood on the other's shoulders, he might be able to reach the first set of footholds and ascend to safety. This was not without its dangers. If the footholds did not travel all the way to the summit, the descent would be precarious. But, after nearly an hour of struggle, the first set of footholds proved tantalizingly out of reach. By then it was very cold, and they set about making a fire. To avoid contact with the boggy ground, they used the metal posts as a base, broke up some wooden planks, poured a little spirit over the improvised pyre, and put a match to it. Despite its dampness, the wood eventually caught alight, providing a little warmth and welcome relief from the plummeting temperatures. When the flames flickered, the boys huddled close together, rubbing their sides and warming their hands. They then took turns in breaking up more wood, storing it near the fire, in hope of drying it out. Next they filled the empty canister with water. While not great, the supply would surely sustain them for a few days. Hungry now, they scoured the ground, hoping to find something palatable to cook over the flames. In the gloom, their search was fruitless, and using the rucksack to cover the ground, they sat by the dwindling fire and side by side eventually fell asleep. By morning they were freezing cold and ravenously hungry, but even in the relative glare of first light, nothing presented itself by way of potential foodstuff, however unappealing. In frustration, they started to call for help again, but their weakness was such, they gave up after only a few minutes. As the day progressed, the more they thought about their empty stomachs, and the slower the second hand seemed to traverse the clock face. "What are we going to do for food?" "I don't know. Perhaps we can eat some vegetation, grass or moss." This they tried, but the bitter-tasting scraps they had to chew into a pulpy mush before swallowing did little to relieve their painful hungriness. "What if nobody comes? We'll starve to death." "Don't worry, someone is sure to be along soon. We'll just have to be very quiet and listen out for them." On the third day, almost deranged through hunger, they came to a terrible decision. "We'll have to cut off a foot or a hand, an arm or leg, and then roast it over the fire. It's the only way." The grave ramifications of the proposal changed everything. They were no longer in this together, and became wary and suspicious of each other. "How are we going to work it out?" "We'll have to draw straws or something. Then, whoever loses must give up his leg. Yes, that's sure to keep us going for a few days. And when it runs out, the winner this time around will give up his leg, and so on, We've got a knife, spirit and bandages, so should be able to carry the whole thing off without too many problems." After much debate, they chose scissors, paper, stone to decide who would go first. Even though this childish game was completely random, each boy went to a separate corner to practice and psych himself up. When ready, they sat cross-legged, facing each other. "Right, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3! Hands thrust forward, paper covered stone. The losing boy lowered his head and started to sob. "I knew I should have gone for scissors." Not wanting to gloat, the victorious boy assumed a grave and serious tone. "Tough luck. It could have been either of us. Now, what shall we do next? Shall I just start cutting, or do you want me to try and knock you out or something? Do you think it will hurt ever so much? It's sure to." Wanting to suffer as little as possible, the losing boy was prepared to risk a blow to the head, whatever the consequences, to lessen the pain. After selecting a sturdy piece of wood, the victorious boy hit his friend across the back of the skull, with far more force than intended, knocking him unconscious. Not wasting any time, he unsheathed the hunting knife and started cutting into the boy's thigh, through the fleshiness near the groin, sawing and hacking off great chunks of flesh. Using a rock, he then pounded and snapped the femur and both tibia and fibula, disconnecting all sinews and tendons with the knife, before moving back up the leg and removing the long thigh bone completely. When finished, he sterilized the wounds with spirit, cauterizing the worst affected areas, and then checked his friend's pulse. It was barely detectable. More through sentiment than any hope for his survival, therefore, he dressed his stump and set about making a fire on which to roast his flesh. Just as he took a first greedy mouthful, he heard voices from above. "Is anyone down there?" Thinking only of freedom and salvation, the boy shot to his feet and shouted back, waving his hands, calling for help. The rescue team acted quickly, taking the injured boy to the hospital, where, 12 hours later, he was still fighting for his life. Being a small town, word of what had happened in the well soon circulated. Local people were outraged, and sympathy for the boy in the hospital only just outweighed the revulsion towards his cannibalistic friend. While many character-building tests of this kind had been carried out over generations, never had participants acted in such a brutal way. Many prominent members of the community resolved to do anything they could to help the victim. In many ways, they blamed themselves and their archaic traditions, and the elder called an emergency meeting. That night in the town hall, the facts of the case were discussed at length, and decisions made regarding the fate of both boys. "This is unprecedented," said the land surveyor. "How could such a simple test go so badly wrong? Those boys were supposed to work together. How did they fail to notice the ladder at the top of the footholds?" "I fear this is indicative of a deeper malaise," said the examining magistrate. "The youth of today is a selfish breed. Our children have no sense of communality, gentlemen. They are motivated purely by self-interest. We've been very short-sighted. We should have acknowledged the changes prevalent in our society, but were too concerned with upholding our traditions." Should he survive, the gathering eventually decided, the amputee was to be provided with special accommodation, easing the burden on his parents, as it was clear he was going to require 24-hour care from now on. And what better way, said the elder, for the other boy to redeem himself, than to be his victim's beck and call for the rest of his days? Within a week, the amputee was out of danger, able to sit up in bed and take on solid foods. By the end of the month, he was transferred to his new living space, a specially adapted single-story abode in the town's most exclusive neighborhood. Here he was provided with every conceivable luxury, given the finest in food and drink, entertainments, cabarets, jesters and musicians, and although not yet of age, he had his own personal harem, filled with the pick of the region's most beautiful women. Throughout the day, and most of the night, he enjoyed pleasures befitting any king, and satiated his most wild sexual desires. 2, sometimes 3 soft-skinned beauties would attend to him at any one time, in ways most grown men could only dream of. But perhaps his greatest pleasure was making his servant and former friend watch as he was caressed and filleted. Greater still, having the boy clean up the arising fluids with a cloth. With relish he ordered him around, belittling him at every opportunity, and whenever he saw a flicker of resentment in the boy's eyes, he would pull the blanket away from his body and point to his stump. Over the next few months, his favourite pastime was watching the boy rod the cesspit at the far end of the grounds. Even though the stench was almost unbearable, even from a distance, he derived great satisfaction from seeing the boy prodding raw sewage with nothing sturdier than a bamboo rod. If the rod broke, he would make the boy clear any blockages with his bare hands, and would roar with laughter when he inevitably choked and gagged. These humiliations infuriated the other boy, having to push the invalid around in his custom-made wheelchair, having to take him to and from the toilet, wiping his private parts, bathing him and patting him dry like some useless, swaddling infant. But there was nothing he could do about it, and he started to curse his luck in the well, wishing he had chosen scissors instead of paper and been blunted by his former friend's stone. A year passed. To be in a position of subservience took its toll. It turned the boy into a shambling wreck. He jumped at every sound, fearful of his next humiliation. To lessen his burden, to blot things out, he started to plunder his master's drinks cabinet. In the early hours of the morning, while the rest of the household slept, he consumed huge amounts of strong fermented wine and dark spirits. It was his only comfort, the only way of escape. One night, drinking in the silence of his box room, looking at the blank, whitewashed walls, he came to a decision as rash as the one he took inside the well, a year or so previous. Going into the kitchen, he grabbed the cook's sharpest knife, laid himself out on the table, and started to hack through his own thigh. Hours later, when the maid found him, he was collapsed unconscious on the floor, barely breathing, his leg partially severed. On arrival, the town doctor managed to stem the bleeding, administer some pain-killing injections, and dress the wounds. For days, the boy slipped in and out of consciousness, but incredibly, despite losing his leg, he survived. It took a few weeks before he regained his strength. When he did, he was castigated for his cowardice, banished from his master's house, and put out onto the streets. What he thought would make him like the other boy, a favourite son, offering a life of luxury and reverence, turned him into a freak, a pariah. Homeless and penniless, he was forced to beg on street corners. Most of the townsfolk ignored him. Some spat at him, or kicked and punched him if he tried to get their attention, and he had to do outrageous things to appeal to those with a cruel, sadistic sense of humour, like eat his own feces or expose himself. When winter set in, his fate was sealed. As he shivered to an excruciating death, so ravaged by frostbite his fingers fell off, his former friend and master wheeled himself into town just to watch him die, sometimes tossing him a scrap of food which the street dogs would snaffle up long before he could rouse himself. The boy perished before the first winter snows. So disgusted were the townsfolk, they refused to remove his body, even after a meeting prescribed a duty of care on the local council. In the end, the dogs and cats ate the festering corpse. All that remained was the legless skeleton, a playpen for scurrying rats.